What I'd like to do for a few minutes before we get into the actual homiletics part of that, I am not a homiletics guy, so I'm going to leave that to Kent. But what I do want to make sure we're all kind of on the same page on is framing the way we think about the workplace in our ministries. I often ask my students if they were to take a poll in their church about how business people saw themselves and their work in relationship to the local church and to the kingdom, what would they say? And think about that for your own church, the church that you serve. What do you think business people would say if you asked them to consider how they see their work and how that connects with how they understand ministry and service to Christ? What my students say are things like this, that business people view themselves as basically sources of funding for the local church and the mission field because they recognize that churches collect revenue, they don't generate it. As one African-American student of mine put it a couple semesters ago in a much more cynical vein. She said, "In my church, business people are pockets to be picked." I thought, yikes, I wasn't quite sure where to start with that. Although they did, what my students do tell me is that many business people that they know take an enormous amount of joy in being able to fund things in the local church and on the mission field. And that's a very significant part of what they consider their impact to be. But they also say things like, I'm useful to my church because I've got administrative skills that are really helpful in running a big operation. There are a lot of business people for whom their local church is actually a bigger operation than their company. And they bring administrative skills sometimes to the table that can be perceived as very useful. A lot of my students tell me that business people see themselves as their workplace being a strategic soapbox for the gospel. They recognize that a lot of the people that they come into contact with will likely never darken the doors of their local church. And I frequently hear business people lament that they're the only Christian in their particular workplace, at which point I always, with a smile, say, "You mean God's entrusted that whole place to you?" I don't think many of them think about it like that. But they see themselves as having a very strategic position to be able to share their faith with people who will probably, unless they drag them kicking and screaming, will probably never come to their church. Others have, I think, a little bit more vision with this, and they see their work as a strategic entree into parts of the world where pastors and missionaries can't gain entrance. This is the business's mission strategy. I suspect all of you know business people who operate this, essentially as what we call tent makers. But the business there is a means to an end of getting entree into countries and regions that are traditionally closed to the gospel. Right? Now, when I push my students a little bit further on this, they also tell me some things that are a little less encouraging than some of these. For instance, they tell me that business people see themselves as not on the front lines of service to Christ. That they typically see what happens in the church building as the front lines of ministry. And so when they come into the church, not when they leave it to go out into the world, is where they see the real place to have an impact for God's kingdom. Sometimes they'll put it even more straightforwardly and say that they feel like they are doing something less than what pastors, missionaries, men and women in parachurch ministry are doing. Sometimes they'll even say, "I feel like a second-class citizen in my church because I'm told repeatedly that the real action in service to God's kingdom is being done by people who get a paycheck from a church or some other Christian organization. And if I really want to maximize my impact for the kingdom, I can't do that by being an accountant or a finance person or sales or something like that. We had Tony Campolo was here some years ago, and in his sort of typical incendiary fashion, challenged business students to get out of their ticky-tack world and do some real ministry. Now, I think I suggest that we think about how business people in our churches see themselves as a starting place. I also get an interesting sample of Talbot students who have come to school from the business community. Some of these men and women have they've started and sold a company, and they've cashed in their chips, and they're sort of coming to seminary trying to figure out, what on earth am I going to do with the rest of my life? Others have made really tough, sacrificial decisions to leave their business, take a significant pay cut, and do what they consider to be entering full-time ministry. Okay? They will say things like, I left my business to serve the Lord full-time. Or that I sold my business or I quit my job in order to enter full-time ministry. Or they'll say things like, I'm so excited to be coming to seminary to prepare for the ministry. And I want to say to them, where did you learn your theology? Hopefully not here. What I'm finding is that even the way we talk about this sometimes betrays our view. Of course, business and the workplace, and I'm going to use business, by the way, as the umbrella term for the workplace. I recognize there's a lot more valid occupations in the workplace than just business, but I'm going to use that for an umbrella term so I don't have to say business and the professions all the time. Of course, business has what we call instrumental value. It is valuable in providing funding for local churches and for the mission field. It is valuable in giving someone a strategic jumping off place to share their faith. It is valuable in giving people contacts, meaningful contacts with non-believers to serve them and to be involved in their lives. It's also, by the way, the ultimate instrumental value. It's a means of support for ourselves and our dependents. And the Scripture is very clear about the necessity of that. But what I want to make sure we're clear on is how the Scripture affirms the intrinsic value of business and the workplace. And it extends to the very work itself that business people do in the workplace. Think about it like this theologically. Work was ordained in Genesis 2 or 3. Which one? 2, correct? I suspect most of our business people think it was ordained in Genesis 3 as part of their penalty. Right? I suspect many of the business people that you minister to see their business as something that they have to do so that they can retire to do something that they really love to do. Okay? In fact, I think some of where we get a misconception on this, if you guys are familiar with the halftime concept, I don't think this is the way it was intended, but I think this is the way it's been interpreted in many of our churches. That at halftime of your life, when you've raised your kids, you know the thesis. When you've raised your kids and kind of been there, done that in business, you move from success to significance, as Bob Buford puts it, and enter in the second half of your life. That's about kingdom work. And I want to say the same thing to my students who say, I left my business to go into full-time ministry. Well, what do you think you were doing while you were in business? What do you think you were doing in the first half of your life? Okay, now to be fair, every once in a while I'll have a student who will say, to be honest, I was serving myself. And I was racking up an empire and seeing how much money I could accumulate. But instead of being challenged to think about how the workplace might be transformed into a place of service to Christ, he felt it's frequent that they feel like the only option for getting that straight in their lives is to leave it behind and to do something completely different. Okay? So that in works ordained in Genesis 2, not 3, which suggests that it has intrinsic value as part of the goodness of creation. In addition, when the Lord returns, I hate to break this to you guys, but when the Lord returns, you will still be working. Okay? The prophets speak about beating swords into plowshares, right? And spears into pruning hooks. The implements of war actually are not just to be done away with, but they are to be transformed into the implements of productive work, which suggests that at both bookends of biblical history, work plays a significant role. Okay, now, to be fair, I'm not exactly sure that when the Lord returns, how we'll deal with the getting a paycheck part. Although I suspect we'll still have money and exchange and things like that. It's just I'm not quite as clear about that. The Bible is clear that we will still be working, and that I think this is part of the reason why in the Scripture there really aren't any categories for retirement. And why so frequently when people retire from their work, they often find that their bodies start to shut down. I suspect you all know people for whom that's true. Okay? Now, in Genesis, work was not only ordained prior to the entrance of sin, it was also intricately connected with the dominion mandate given to human beings. God ordained dominion and ordained the means by which dominion would be exercised, both through work and through procreation, because Adam and Eve were not equipped to do that by themselves. And then if you think about it a little bit further, in the Genesis account, God is portrayed as a worker. I mean, right from the beginning, God is about his work in creation. He rests from his work. Throughout the Old Testament, God is described as being at work to maintain and sustain his creation. Jesus, in what I consider to be one of his strongest claims to deity, claims that he is still working on the Sabbath as my Father is working. So it seems to me that a part of the dignity of work comes from this idea that this is the way God is portrayed, and therefore is a significant part, not the whole, but a significant part of what it means to be made in his image. That is, as Chuck Colson puts it, I like the way he puts this, that we are hardwired for work. Okay, now that doesn't mean that we are bound to getting a paycheck for as long as we are here on this earth. But I think it does suggest that we are to be about productive activity in service to Christ throughout our days here. Now, of course, as your health dictates and as your energy level dictates, the pace at which you do that slows down, and I suspect for most of you it could use slowing down. Maybe even now it could use slowing down. But there's an intrinsic goodness to work that I think the Scripture ordains, which I think is what Paul had in mind when he wrote to the Colossians. In Colossians 3:23, and whatever you do, work at it with all your heart as working for the Lord, not for human masters, since you know you'll receive a reward, inheritance from the Lord as a reward. For, and I think in parenthesis here, and whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. Okay, now notice who this was written to. Who's the specific recipient of this? What's their occupation? Notice in 22, sets the context for this. Slaves, obey your earthly masters in everything. He's addressing slaves here. The argument he's making is slaves, in whatever you do, it's the Lord Christ whom you are serving. Okay? And arguably, slaves in the first century did the most menial, mindless, manual labor, grunt work that you can imagine, all of the things that we would suggest are maybe even beneath the idea of dignity for our work. But yet Paul affirms that the work of slaves is something that they are to do with excellence because in their work as slaves, they are serving another master, not primarily their earthly one. Now, to be sure, I think to be really clear about this, when I talk to business people about their ministry in the workplace, most of the time they say things like this. This is what they consider to be their impact in their ministry in the workplace, when they're sharing their faith with a coworker, when they're praying for a coworker, or when they're going out of their way to serve a coworker who's going through a crisis in their life or something like that. It's very rare that they actually think about their work as part of their ministry. In fact, for most business people I'm aware of, the things that count as ministry in the workplace are those things that they're doing when they're not doing their jobs, and actually putting them at risk of theft from their employer if they do too much of it. Okay? This is why at a place like Biola, this is why Biola is a university and not a Bible college. In fact, if you go over to the School of Business just across the way here, and you go in, it's hard to miss. But the inscription right on the board, in fact, it's just next to the TV with all the stock quotes on it, which is why most people don't miss it. But it says business as ministry. And if you think about it, they could have said that a number of different ways. They could have said business and ministry, right? Or they could have said ministry in business. But I think they captured it just right when they said business as ministry, business as a form of service to Christ. And this, it seems to me, is something I think that a lot of our business people don't catch. That their work is actually a significant part of their service to Christ in the workplace, and hence the reason they're commanded to do it with excellence. That's why we say accounting is ministry. You know, finance is ministry. Filmmaking is ministry. Sales is ministry. Nursing is ministry. Pastoring is ministry. Evangelism is ministry. Okay? Now, interestingly, when the term is used, I believe the term ministry, diakonia, is used for the first time in Acts chapter 6 to describe the early church and their ministry. It's very interesting. It's used, the same term is used to describe the ministry of the distribution of food to widows, to which the deacons were appointed, and the diakonia, the ministry of the word. Interestingly, both of those are described as ministry or as service. I mean, diakonia is most commonly translated as service. And yet in the New Testament, almost always there is something that qualifies the use of that term. It's not intended to stand by itself. So it's pastoral ministry, or it's missionary ministry. It's the ministry of the distribution of food, or the ministry of the word. But it's much more rare that that term stands alone, unqualified. And see, this is what I tell my students. When you enter full-time ministry, at what point? Right? You enter full-time service at the point you come to faith, not at the point you decide where you're going to get a paycheck from. Right? And you know, I can't tell how many times I've heard, you know, somebody will step down from their pastorate and say, what? I'm leaving the ministry. And I said, no, you're not. In fact, when somebody tells me they're leaving the ministry, I get a quite alarmed look on my face and wonder, well, have you defected from your faith? Because last time I checked in the New Testament, that's the only way you leave full-time service. I'm not even sure that death gets you out of full-time service. But if that's true, then I mean, what somebody does when they step down from a pastorate is they simply are changing arenas of service. That's what the halftime thing is people having a chance to reevaluate their gifts and skills and passions and to change arenas of service. But I suspect we might view a little differently the person who does that halftime assessment and stays in business. And see, I think what we ought to be affirming is that that's just as valid a choice as the choice to do something where they're earning a paycheck from a church or another Christian organization. Here's what makes me nervous is I think we risk returning to a medieval hierarchy where priests, nuns, and monks had callings and vocations, and everybody else had jobs to support them. And I think Luther and the Reformers got this essentially right, where they said, no, there is such a thing as a worldly calling. As Calvin put it, the whole world is a theater of God's glory. And I love Luther in his own sort of unique style put it that even the hangman brings honor to God if he does his work well. Okay, I admit there's a certain assumption there on the death penalty I'm aware of. And even Calvin described politics as an arena of God's glory. Okay, I'm not sure he'd run for office in California, but we'll think about that. But the notion that you could work out your calling in the world without having to be cloistered, I think was one of the most important legacies of the Reformation that provided the ideological fuel for the Industrial Revolution. Now, I think it would have gotten off the ground eventually, but it was really helpful to have that as a theological starter in that way. Now, think about what you guys will do, I suspect this summer, when you have I suspect you'll have teams that will go out on short-term mission trips. You may have students that will go out. We do this, we send a ton of students out here on short-term mission trips here. And we make a big deal out of commissioning them. And it is a big deal because they're taking a huge step of faith. But I always find it ironic that we don't do anything for our film students who are going to go out this summer to do internships at places like Disney, MTV, Universal Studios, NBC, arguably, in my view, just as significant a step of faith and just as foreign a culture as places halfway around the world. I'm not sure we do anything for our accounting students who are going to go do internships this summer at the big 4, 3, however many of them are left. Accounting firm, I'm not too sure about the number, but they'll do internships there. And I wonder, what do we do to publicly affirm and commission the business people to their service to Christ? We had our fall faculty retreat was on this subject, and we invited about 15 local CEOs from the area. And at the end, it was the most meaningful, powerful time of the whole thing. We commissioned them along with our new faculty at the same time, commissioned them to their place of service in the same way we commissioned our own faculty to their place of service here. And I think they felt a genuine sense of partnership with us in this, that the work itself was being affirmed in addition to what other things God could do in the workplace. See, I think for us, I think where a lot of this starts is just how we talk about this. Okay? I don't ever let anybody get away, or I do my best to try to call people when I hear them say, I'm going into full-time ministry. I said, I didn't know you had just come to faith. Or actually you're doing nothing of the sort. You're just changing arenas of service. Okay? I try not to use the term I'm going into ministry. I try not to refer to what we do in teaching and pastoring and missions as ministry, just by itself, as though what people do in the workplace is something else besides that. I think that's the impression that often is left. I try never to use the term ministry without some kind of qualifier on that. And see, I think if we change the way we talk about this, our business people will pick that up. And again, it's very interesting with some of my students who come from, particularly from ethnic Asian backgrounds. We find that some of this hierarchy between the pastorate and the business person is a little bit more pronounced in some of those cultures, and more, I think more difficult to talk about in this way. And I think the business people who are in some different ethnic cultures, in my view, face a little bit more of an uphill battle to see their work as having the nobility and the ministry component that I think the Scripture teaches that it does. So who's got an iPhone 4 here? Anybody? We have one of the men on our board here. His company makes this little metal part that goes all the way around the iPhone. It's called liquid metal. And it's designed to be stronger than steel, but flexible like aluminum. An incredible product. He took liquid metal public just recently. It's the second company he's taken public. He's just an incredibly successful business person. But I had a chance to talk to him at our faculty retreat last fall. And he said, I've always felt like I'm not doing what I should be doing. Because my dad was a pastor. And I always felt like the best thing that I could do was to be a pastor. And he has always felt like a second-class citizen in his church, and the stuff that he is doing, he just felt like this just doesn't count as much as what my dad has always done. Now, I think there's probably some father-son dynamics in there too. But what he has done in the business community is off the charts successful. And the opportunities he's had to bear testimony to his faith and his trust in God has just been terrific. But yet he comes to church and feels like, I ought to be a pastor. Right? When it seems obvious to me that his gifts and skills and calling and talents are all in business. I got this note from a student just this last semester after talking about this a bit. She said, thank you very much, Dr. Ray. I wanted to tell you how liberating it was to be in class today. My parents were successful business owners who were doing very well in business, but they always felt guilty doing well in business because they believed they should be doing pastoral ministry and that missionary ministry is the best thing that they should do. So after a short mission trip, they believed they should do full-time missionary work to do the godly thing. Sold all of their properties, all of their businesses, and became missionaries. I don't think they are truly happy doing what they are doing. She said, I thought it was great how you told the class that we can do ministry without working in a church or being a missionary. Though my parents think I came to seminary to be a pastor, I came to seminary to rest and to learn about God. I think it's terrific that I can do other things in life serving Christ besides a pastor or missionary. And for this person, not that they were knocking down the pastorate or the mission field, but they just felt so liberated to be able to think about using their gifts and their skills and their passions in a business that is serving Christ analogous to the way pastors and people in the mission field serve Christ. And what I told her was that if you think about this, if it's true that what you would do in business is serving Christ in the world analogous to the way pastors and missionaries serve Christ in the local church and on the mission field, then what follows from that is that that has eternal significance. That service to Christ in the workplace has eternal value. It's not something that you do so that you can do something else that has eternal value, but that in and of itself does.
Biola University offers a variety of biblically centered degree programs, ranging from business to ministry to the arts and sciences. Visit biola.edu to find out how Biola could make a difference in your life.